All right, we're ready to begin. Welcome to all, and thank you for joining us today. This is session 6, which focuses on coaching educators in their efforts to support students with grief and loss processing and managing anxiety and worries in the classroom. The purpose of this discussion is pretty simple. There are 3.7 million elementary and secondary school teachers in the United States, and they're each responsible for the academic and the social emotional progress of nearly 60 million children. They're the friendly face greeting families in the morning. They're the voice of authority. They're quieting classroom disputes. They're supportive adults helping students moderate and work through complex emotions. And they're also, on top of that, coaching youth sports, reaching out to parents, leading departmental meetings, organizing coat drives, all that. In September, assuming that schools open in September when we expect them to, that army of professionals is going to have to deal with an entirely new responsibility placed right at the top of an already diverse and really heavy load. Every student returning to school or attending school for the first time will have experienced the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thousands will have lost a loved one, a caretaker, maybe a community member. Millions will have spent half a year or more in a novel form of social isolation, walled off from friends and family. Educators are expected to manage behavior and provide a safe learning environment for their classrooms. And as the TREP project at UChicago has documented, teachers take the lead in identifying and helping to address trauma that students experience outside of school. But they've never been trained to deal with the aftermath of a crisis like this one. And even as they try to help their kids catch up with months of lost learning time, they'll need to keep an eye out on the tension and the strain that are going to be the hallmarks of this COVID crisis in the period that follows. That's why teachers can't do it alone, capable though they are. When they reopen, schools need to be prepared to focus explicitly on the psychological damage inflicted by this year's emergencies. School leaders must make their buildings oases of calm in communities that have known a lot of chaos and a lot of disruption. Behavioral and mental health specialists need to share strategies and collaborate with teachers to lighten their load. And perhaps most importantly, teachers themselves must be available both to students and one another as the residual or secondary stress of confronting negative emotion takes its toll. I'm Kevin Mankin. I am a senior writer for the 74million.org. We're a nonprofit education news site. I'll be leading the discussion this afternoon. In the discussion, I am joined by a powerhouse lineup of guests who will explore how to prepare teachers for the challenges that await them. Jamila Bowden is a TREP project school coach. She is also a practicing licensed professional counselor, and she has taught students from kindergarten through college. Sonia Dinizulu is an assistant professor and child and adolescent clinical psychologist at University of Chicago Medicine. She specializes in trauma and resilience treatment. Jennifer Mead is the director of school social work in the School of Service Administration at the University of Chicago. Her focus areas are special education and school community partnerships. And finally, Erin Nation is an elementary school counselor and counseling resource developer. And she's worked for the State Department of Education and taught kindergarten. So all of these panelists are going to have brief presentations before we initiate this panel discussion. And we're actually going to start with you, Jennifer, because you have an exercise, I believe, that you like for the participants to take part in.
Great, thank you very much, Kevin. So good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be with this great group of professionals and also with all of you out there in Zoom land. I want to say a special shout out to my former students and current students, and to the phenomenal educators and school social workers that I've had the pleasure of working with over a number of years. But I need to start out today by asking you all a favor. I need you to help me regulate my nervous system. So I've never presented to a faceless, anonymous crowd before. When I teach, I really pride myself on connecting with my students. So eye contact, facial expressions, affirmative nods, eye rolling, exhausted sighs. These are all part of what I base my teaching on when I read the room, and they're deeply important to me, and so are building relationships. So doing this very anonymous presentation is really different for me, and definitely very activating to my nervous system. So I will say that as part of that, it feels awkward and unsettling and dysregulating. So that's where I really need you to help me out. So I want to talk a little bit about when we experience nervous system dysregulation. Just to give some context, this is not a process of thoughts first and feelings second. It's something we feel in our bodies before we even know what's going on. So for me, I usually feel something in my stomach. I feel something in my chest. For other people, it shows up elsewhere. It might be restlessness. It might be shutting down and putting their heads on a desk and checking out with their bodies. So when we're in a dysregulated state, we're not open to taking in new information, and we're not open to learning, and we're not open to building relationships. But we're guarded, and we're wary, and we're checking things out to see if our environment is safe. For students, they're often scoping out the room. They're reading your body language. Maybe as adults in professional developments, we have one eye on the presenter and the other eye on our phone. I've been there many times and done that myself. So this is, I want to first start by saying this is a really primal, hardwired instinct of ours. Before we can engage, we need to know that the environment is safe, and we need to feel comfortable, and we need to feel connected. Not to mention that it's harder to do that after lunch when you had a break. So, so back to the helping me out piece. So I want you to help me regulate my nervous system, and I want to help you regulate yours. So this is what we call co-regulation. So I want you to just do me a favor and find yourself a comfortable place for right now. And that might mean sitting in a comfortable chair. It might be laying down. It might be standing up to give yourself a bit of a stretch. But whatever makes you feel good is great. And the beauty of it is nobody can see you, so you can do whatever it is that you want that's comfortable for you. So now that you're in a comfortable spot, I want you to pay some attention to what your breathing is doing. Just notice it. There's no need to alter your breathing in any way at this point. Just be curious. Are you taking slow, deep breaths? Are you taking quick, shallow breaths? Or is it somewhere in between? So just notice that for a moment. And now, with your body in a comfortable place and your attention to your breath, I want you to take one hand and put it on your diaphragm, which is right about just above your navel. So put a hand on your diaphragm, and I'd like you to put another hand on your chest. And I'd like you, with your hands resting comfortably for all of us, to take a deep breath in for the count of 5 seconds. And then we're going to hold it, and then we're going to release it for 5 seconds after that. So just join me. We're going to take a deep breath in, hold it, and then release. And take another deep breath in, hold it, and release. I want to thank you for doing that with me, because I don't know about you, but that has helped me regulate my nervous system more than I felt coming into this. And I hope that you feel the same way too. And that whole process took about 3 minutes. So part of the reason why I did this, obviously too, in addition to just helping myself relax and hopefully helping you relax and feel more connected and safe in this space, is to demonstrate that this is something really easy to do in your classroom. It doesn't just have to be done in a morning meeting. It can be done in a staff meeting. It can be done in in every class. It can be done after recess. It can be done after lunch. It can be done before you dismiss for the day. But it's a really quick, comfortable, easy way to center all of us and kind of come to the same place of openness to learning. I also want to point out that there's no need to tell people to close their eyes. For some of our students, particularly students who've experienced trauma, closing your eyes is a really threatening experience. So if that's where people are comfortable, they can do that, but there's no need to force that issue. So Joe, if you could go to slide 2, I would appreciate that. Perfect, thank you. So when our students are regulated, they're ready to learn, but when they're dysregulated, they're not ready to learn. So you're probably familiar with hearing about the sympathetic nervous system. That's really the fight or flight or chaos state of our autonomic nervous system. And that usually shows up for our students and ourselves in externalizing ways. So things that we can see. So students might have a hard time sitting still. They'll feel restless. These are students who might elope from the classroom. They might feel agitated. They might feel angry. These are students or ourselves who have difficulty sleeping. I know I've had a lot of difficulty sleeping, not just in COVID, but in this time of really intense unrest and all the emotional charge that's going on right now. So that's how we might see this part of our nervous system show up in our classrooms and in ourselves. And then there's the parasympathetic nervous system also. So this is sometimes called the rest and digest system. This is where we typically are in a regulated state, but we can also have a dysregulated parasympathetic response too. And sometimes that manifests as a shutdown or a collapse when students or when we are feeling dysregulated. So this might be the part of us that right now is tempted to just kind of curl up in a ball on the couch and watch Netflix or escape. This is kind of our need to regulate ourselves is showing up in ways of protecting ourselves by shutting down. So for students, this might look like disengagement in class. It might look like withdrawal. It might look like a lack of energy or feeling really tired or just a loss of enthusiasm for things that they've been enthusiastic before, or it might show up in feelings of hopelessness or loneliness or profound despairing. So if you could go back, Joe, to the other slide, that would be great. Thank you. So I want to walk into this work next year with a real understanding that all of our nervous systems together need to be co-regulated in the classroom for us to be able to work together and be in a shared space that's comfortable and safe. And I want to also provide a context that is really helpful to me for thinking about this framework of trauma that we are experiencing right now. And so I think of it as a Venn diagram. And I think this is really important for us to conceptualize trauma in multiple layers and facets, because we're all living somewhere in this Venn diagram at any given point in time right now. So collective trauma refers to our shared reaction psychologically to an event that's affecting an entire group of society. So right now we're living through 2 really profound, deep collective traumas. And people are, I want to, preface this by saying people are experiencing this in really different ways, but this is part of what's the framework of what's happening all around us right now. We also bring to this work, and our students bring to the classroom every day, our own individual trauma. So that's our unique and lived experiences of past trauma, present trauma, and that's going to be really different for different people and at different times. So not everybody is living in a place of where individual trauma is the most prominent, but there's going to be that overlay to their experiences all the time. And then secondary trauma is the trauma it's the distress we experience from exposure to the traumatic experiences of others. So seeing the tragic and painful video of George Floyd being killed by police is provoking and producing a secondary trauma in all of us, but in particular, our students of color and their families. And we as educators deal with secondary trauma all the time as well. Our students, we're in this profession because we feel deeply, and our students come to our classrooms every day having experienced many of them having experienced some kind of trauma at some point in their lives. And we are also absorbing that for them too. So that's impacting us, it's impacting our students as well. And I share all of this just because I think it's really very important to go into the work that we're doing now and the work next year, recognizing that there's no fourth wall between us and our students. I think, as an educator myself and as a trained school social worker, I've often fallen I've been susceptible to this notion that there's an us and a them. There's a difference. We're the adults in the space, and these are the kids, or we're the well-informed, educated people, and these are our parents, and they're not, and we have to impart something to them. But really, what I want to emphasize is that we are co-experiencing trauma together in very different, unique ways. But it's important to understand that and recognize that and bring that acknowledgement to the table in all of the work that we do. This time that we're living in is very activating and dysregulating for our nervous systems. But the other important thing to remember is that activation plus co-regulation leads to connectedness. And I think that connectedness is going to be what's going to help us the most when we return to school in the fall and getting through where we are right now.
Excellent. Thank you, Jennifer. I believe that next is Jamila.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Jennifer, for starting us out with mindfulness. Definitely an important reminder for all of us to just stop and take a breath. And in these times, we don't want to just take a breath for our own desperately needed self-care, but we also want to take a breath for those who are unable to do so, either because they've been violently snatched from this earth too soon, or we need to remind ourselves to stop and take a breath for those who are the most intensely dehumanized, marginalized, belittled, dismissed. When we stop and take a breath for them, it means acknowledging the ignored. It means allowing any of our life work not to go forth without having in mind the purposes and struggles of those that society considers to be the least of these. So an important reminder, and this ties in perfectly to the struggles that our students will be facing whenever we return to in-person teaching and learning. Whatever considerations you have for what needs to be done, if it doesn't work for your most vulnerable and disenfranchised and most traumatized student, then it just doesn't work. And here's what I want to share overall. When we return to school, even though 100% of your students will have been impacted by this collective trauma of COVID-19 and the collective trauma of this social movement against systemic injustice, you will not see 100% of your students moping around and sad and outwardly depressed and complaining on day one. Because that's just not how kids operate. Up front, what you're going to see is these absolutely beautiful, glowing faces and beaming smiles of the students who've just been away too long. They will be happy to see you. They'll be happy to see their friends, the school building, just happy to be back to something familiar. They will laugh, they will smile, they will play, they may even have a good time. But coexisting with those smiles will be that turmoil, the disappointment, the fear, the anxiety, the stress, and the overwhelming grief. And all of those emotions will also be exponentially compounded for those students who've had to endure unsafe, unstable, destructive, or emotionally, physically, or sexually abusive households. How children are processing, experiencing, and feeling all of what they're going through is inevitably going to begin to come out in ways that impact every facet of their being. And how do we know? So this takes us to my first slide. we see that what research tells us is that when students experience trauma, they are going to be impaired in one or likely more of these 7 domains. So behavior, emotions, brain development and functioning, mental well-being, social connectivity, self-concept, and with learning. They are going to have difficulties with thinking, focused attention, concentration, memory, transitions. So pretty much everything that we're asking them to do at school. And still, we're going to have teachers who are going to want to put all of this aside so that I can teach you math. Or we're going to have teachers who are going to say, look, we've talked about this enough. It's just ad nauseum. I'm ready to move on. So drop everything and read. But clearly, it is not going to work. And so as we advance to the next slide, one of the earlier panelists, Kathleen Beachford, she put it so succinctly, but really meaningfully for me, is that Maslow has to come before Bloom. And so what I'm saying is exactly that. What we're saying is exactly that, but it can't fall all on the teachers. It can't all be on the counselors either. The social workers, the social emotional specialists, as their caseloads pile up because, oh my gosh, there are these students who are not fulfilling the expectations that I have for them in class. It has to be a whole school and preferably even district-wide approach, an effort to rebuild what we already know has been diminished or lost for our students. So the school-wide efforts look like planning along with the administrators, planning along with the behavioral health team, ongoing, meaning throughout the entire year. This is not something that kids are just going to get over, or adults are just going to get over at some point. So I'm giving them to November and that's it. So ongoing school-wide focus on rebuilding trust. Why trust? Because the school, who has been that trustworthy place, has not been able to be there for our students who needed help when they needed help. They're going to have a school-wide focus on establishing safety, because this world right now doesn't feel like a very safe place, particularly when you've had your sense of safety completely shattered. There's going to have to be a school-wide focus on building resilience and promoting family within this building, where we acknowledge what you've been through. We understand what you've been through, and we are here to support you, not to punish you because you are communicating what's going on inside of you. And then the clinicians then are able to simply build on those school-wide efforts through workshops, through pushing into the classroom, through doing sessions, through doing talking circles, town hall meetings, assemblies, etc. So that they can give the students the tools that they need and the language that they need to be able to process all of this stuff that's going on within them. And in doing that, they're going to, at the same time, be modeling for teachers who can then take that language and take the approaches and simply build on it and extend those lessons that have been taught by the clinicians. And the clinicians have also offered or are offering anchor charts and other resources for the teachers to have and post, and for the students to have and refer to on an ongoing basis in a very immediate way, which then also makes sure that there's continuity across the whole school, which is also another way of building safety. The other thing that teachers will need to do in the classroom is have a different lens, take on a different lens to seeing behavior, not only as communication, but seeing the behavioral errors that we will see, that inevitably we're going to see, and approach them in the same ways that we approach academic errors. So it has to be instructional, it has to be taught. If there's something that you are not able to do at this particular moment, then I have to offer you the supports and the strategies to be able to accomplish what I'm asking you to do. And then lastly, embedding those coping skills, embedding the tools of resilience in daily practices, not just a lesson that we do for 15 minutes in the morning, which is a start, but embedding it in everything that we do, in your lessons, in your practices, and throughout the school building. And that's how we can help that's what I believe is the way that we can approach helping our students to get where they need to be and get through these collective traumas. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamila. And now I believe it's time to turn to Sonia.
Okay, good afternoon. If you can share my screen, or I can share it myself, right? Are you able to share my screen?
You should be able to share your screen now. I apologize for that.
Okay. Can you guys see it or no?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Sorry. This is. Let me see if I can find you. Sorry. I had this all together. Where are you guys? Okay, here we go.
There we go. Excellent.
There we go. Thank you for your patience, everyone. So I am so thankful to Jennifer and Jamila for taking the time to do a lot of the teaching around what trauma looks like for people, and particularly for children, and with an added developmental perspective. It's so important to keep that in mind, because when people think of trauma, they think of it, what it looks like for adults, and they don't think about when trauma is being experienced for a child, the whole developmental aspect of their very being, every aspect of it has been attacked. So thank you for doing that. And I very much needed, Jennifer, that mindfulness. I'm just gonna put myself out there. It's been a stressful week for me last week. Been involved in 2 protests. This is my 4th panel discussion for this week, helping my own institution, trying to figure out how to navigate and be responsive and sensitive to people of color in my own institution during this really difficult time. So I can't imagine that schools, I can't imagine that schools need to do the same as well. It's very much of a needed topic. So I'm going to keep my remarks really short, because I know that our moderator, Kevin, is going to ask some really, really good questions, and I know we want the audience to hear. But I want to talk about just a couple of things for us to consider. For one, I really do think we're experiencing a paradox in the midst of this pandemic. One hand, we have this hashtag called "We're in together," we're all in this together. On the other hand, we have people who are experiencing significant disparities that have been unearthed because of the paradox. Like, these things have been there before, but may not have been necessarily in the forefront of people's minds, such as health disparities and even educational disparities, and the disparities that I'm seeing with, my own patients that I work with, who are having difficulty just accessing the resources, the little resources that they have online, the digital divide that really does exist. They're having a really difficult time trying to complete whatever assignments they need to do, whatever the case may be. So it's kind of like we're feeling resilient. We've been bending the curve. People are doing what they're supposed to do to maintain the spread as much as possible. But at the same time, we're feeling a lot of pain, and it's a confusing time emotionally. And I know it can be that way for our kids. So I just wanted to put that out there, that it's a messy time, and I think that message has been reverberated throughout this entire conference so far, and it's something that we need to pay attention to, both that the pandemic of COVID-19, and also all of the racial disparities, structural barriers, and difficulties that have arrived from both situations, with the latest happening with George Floyd's murder. So I want to talk about the potential mental health effects of COVID-19 for our students. We honestly don't know. We're at the very beginning still of what COVID-19, how it's going to directly impact our students. We can surmise, we can think about ways that they might be affected. We can anticipate anxiety, we can anticipate trauma, we can anticipate depression, we can anticipate enhanced behavioral problems. It could be a lot of things that could come out of this, and we should rightfully so anticipate and prepare and mobilize and get the resources together just to err on the side of caution. But at the same time, I don't want us to all assume that everyone is going to come out damaged from this. There are certain things about this crisis that could be an opportunity for others, and I want us to think about how can we learn from this crisis and create opportunities from it. We always hear the saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. So, but some of the things that could potentially affect our students is, in particular for, for people of color and other ethnic groups, because of the disparities that exist in access to mental health services, and schools are often left to be defaulted to take care of that, and it's overburdensome for schools. But in particular, some students may experience traumatic stress symptoms. Most students, and I forgot to mention in the very beginning, I forgot to introduce myself as a clinician. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I work with youth and families exposed to trauma and violence, and my research also deals with community mental health services research. But most of the people the students or patients that I work with are not diagnosed with PTSD, but because they just don't meet criteria, because that's a whole nother story of the DSM-5. However, but many of them have post-traumatic stress symptoms, and no matter what, disorder or not, the symptoms are there and the treatments are going to be the same. So traumatic stress could be a part of that. It could be a part of that because of losing a loved one to COVID-19, also dealing with police brutality in the community, or dealing with structural violence within their community. Not being able to go to the nearest supermarket to get food can cause additional stress. So dealing with the social determinants of health, like food insecurity, job insecurity, and those things are really stressful things that can exacerbate traumatic stress. Depression, anxiety, social isolation, and loneliness, of course. Some of those things that COVID-19 may have enhanced for those who already had underlying symptoms of those three areas. Low self-esteem. For my teenagers, increased substance use has definitely, anecdotally I see, has increased. Marijuana in particular. Grief, suicidal ideation, and exacerbated learning disabilities for those kids who have autism, for those kids with ADHD, for those kids who have social anxiety, whatever those case may be, some of those symptoms could be exacerbated. Although I think my social anxiety kids are okay because they don't have to socialize with other people, but again, that might show up, manifest into something a little bit more problematic later. We will see. So COVID-19 and students of color, I really want us to pay attention to this. And I think I'm not going to belabor this point because I've heard it so eloquently stated by so many of the wonderful educators and other people who are in this field collaboratively to work with students and staff and educators. But we know that there are disparities that exist between people of color and non-people of color, or white people in particular, that COVID-19 has impacted our Black and brown families very hard. And it's not because of that we don't know how to social distance or because we didn't wear masks or anything like that. It has nothing to do with that. It's just because of the underlying factors that contribute to health disparities that then make COVID-19 even more deadly for our population. The need to keep trauma responsive practices and culture front and center is also really important. Again, many of the colleagues here have said really wonderful things about if a child is behaviorally dysregulated. Oftentimes it could be that children could be automatically sent to the principal's office with a punishment or given detention or demerits, LaSalle's. I've heard so many names for it, but basically punished. And that is re-traumatizing. When simply, teachers, I wish more people would ask and have this mindset. It's not just about teachers, it's just people in general. But my word of advice, and some of you may have heard this before, is that instead of asking what's wrong with you, get your stuff together, ask what happened to you. When you're able to connect to a child, you connect first emotionally because, again, trauma disrupts the emotional regulation within a child, behavioral dysregulation within a child, cognitive, attachment issues, all of those things that were mentioned in a slide by, I think, either Jamila or Jennifer. But either way, those developmental aspects are attacked. And so when we're trying to regulate, co-regulate with the child, it's so important to connect with them emotionally. I see you, you look upset. Some of you may think that might not work in the moment, but when you get into a coercive cycle with the child, you're only revving them up to be more hypervigilant. We gotta break that cycle. And by a teacher or by a staff, any staff person, I believe that it takes a whole village to raise a child. I really do. So anywhere from people who do the lunchroom, people who provide food service in the schools, people who provide cleaning services, the custodial staff, all of that matters. But being able to co-regulate with a child, let's calm down first, let's connect, and then redirect the behavior later. It's so important to connect. Trauma disrupts the emotional and behavioral systems that are wired in our brain. So it's so important to connect with them emotionally and then try to redirect that behavior later when things have calmed down. When the brain goes off to be hypervigilant, there is no rational reasoning. It just goes out of control. So try to stop it before it explodes. And people can try to tell and read those signs as much as possible. Perceived versus actual danger, sense of safety. I think it's so important to understand that, again, it's been mentioned before that everyone who's experienced these pandemics that could be potentially traumatic for, it's a trauma exposure for everyone. How everyone receives that trauma, processes that trauma, affected by that trauma, depends on so many factors. So basically it's not going to be the same for everyone. But I want you to understand that for some kids, so for some families, that their perceived sense of safety or danger, if children have been wired or over time developmentally to experience so many traumatic exposures, it's going to be hard for them to tell the difference between perceived versus actual sense of danger or safety. So they may think everybody's always after them. You know, you're always talking bad about me, you're always saying mean things to me, I'm always getting in trouble, even though this is not a trauma like seeing someone interpersonally, violent type of actions like George Floyd, but the fact that their emotional sense of safety is being attacked because of punitive practices or because of verbal or nonverbal communications that are not encouraging is re-traumatizing. And for some kids, they're going to be more sensitive than others. And so keeping in mind that they need to understand the difference between actual sense of safety and perceived sense of safety or danger. And the school staff can really help with that, but by, again, trying to think of practices that are not going to be punitive, trying to really validate emotions, even validate the behavior. Doesn't mean you're condoning it. It's just like, you knocked over the table, it makes sense. Tell me what's happening, what's going on versus what's wrong with you. And then also having evidence-based coping strategies, and I'll go through this really quickly because I have this in the practice brief, but there's a couple of things. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail again, but there's a couple of things that I didn't mention in the practice brief that you'll get 1 week after the conference proceedings. And one of them is looking at psychological first aid for schools. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network, so nctsn.org, our tax dollars pay for it. We should use it. There's a slew of resources that are created for parents, for educators, for mental health professionals, for administrators. I encourage that you use it and look into this. But psychological first aid for schools is something that I'm going to put out there. Don't know if every school can really implement such a thing, but it might be useful to take a look at it and decide for yourself that that would be useful. But psychological first aid basically deals with, trying to implement trauma-informed practices to help deal with an immediate crisis. And even though this is not like Hurricane Katrina or anything like that, but sheltering in place would be considered something that could fall under the need for using psychological first aid. But more practically, something that people can pick up right away in the classroom setting is something, in my field in mental health, we have something called the common elements. And these are the common elements that we see across all different types of therapies for anxiety, depression, trauma, for kids who need behavioral management supports. These are some of the common strategies or elements that are evidence-based strategies that can be used to help improve mental health. So with trauma, and I'm also providing it from a trauma-informed perspective, but overall, when we talk about, having kids integrated back to school, whether it's a mixture of in-person and virtual, all virtual initially, doesn't matter. We have to figure out how to create rituals and routines. The first line of defense, whenever you treat someone with trauma, you must establish a sense of safety. And part of building safety can be embedded in the practice of rituals and routines. Every teacher has it. It could be good morning, it could be a song, it could be a quick check-in. Whatever that ritual and routine is for you, I highly recommend that you do some things like that. 2, stress management. This has been, Jamila and Jennifer have already said this. And Jennifer led us off with a nice mindfulness activity, but stress management is so critical to help use these strategies, 1 minute strategies, 2 minute strategies. My iWatch reminds me every day to take a breathing for 1 minute. 1 minute can this be built in multiple times out of the day of doing stress management. It could be grounding techniques. Hey class, I see everybody's talking around. Name 5 things you can see, 4 things that you can hear, 3 things that you can touch. I don't know about tasting, but any of those 5 senses can be activated. It could be breathing, anything and everything that can be used to help regulate the senses, the nervous system. I highly recommend, and again, the practice brief talks a little bit more about that. Psychoeducation, another strong key component, intervention component that can be really helpful for teachers to do. And in the classroom setting, I would imagine ask teachers really taking the time to not avoid questions about COVID-19, to not avoid questions about some of the racial injustices and abuse that we've seen in our country against Black and brown bodies. But it's really advised to address these questions. And if you don't know, say, I don't know, and I'll learn more about it, and I want to find out more about it, and we'll talk about it later. But welcome students' questions. Don't avoid questions that you can't answer. Tolerating uncertainty. You got to ride the wave. When you're anxious, it's okay to tolerate the uncertainty, because if you keep trying to placate and try to appease and diminish the anxiety, then it makes people become less tolerant. This is a time of unknown still. We're still in a time of unknown. So it's really important to help set a model for tolerating anxiety. Set the tone, try to be optimistic, try to be grounded, and then also, just keep it real. Be developmentally appropriate. Focus on what you're doing to stay safe. So if you are, again, trying to promote living life by facts and not by fears around COVID-19 and other situations, keep students updated and normalize their experiences and validate it. And that leads to the other point too. Another technique is to validate emotions and empathize. Again, the practice brief, I talk about how to identify, express, and regulate their emotions, like a quick mood check-in. Everybody has their name. And then check in, move their faces to over the mood, and then, you guys can talk about it individually or however you want to process that. That's something that could be useful for teenagers. They can do something online with their computers or their phones. I don't know if phones would be allowed, but there's many ways that you can do a quick check-in. And like I said before, if someone in the moment is dysregulated, try to connect with their emotions first and redirect. Connecting meaning by validating. And then problem solving is the last type of mental health tool that's across all different therapies, but also could be used in the classroom. Problem solving happens all the time. And I think teachers can use an opportunity to problem solve. The last thing is to have compassion for yourself, for the situations, for the looting and the riots, for the stores. My Walgreens is closed down. I have to find a place to get things. Having compassion for the whole situation and not condemning and not talking bad about, but perspective taking, which is a part of problem solving, that is really important. And when you're able to offer different perspectives, that can help students feel a little bit more appreciative and regulated. Helping students cope with grief is another topic that, again, you can read a little bit more about in the policy practice, but we can also talk about in the Q&A. And the last thing I want to say is, I'm hearing this all the time, and Huntington Learning Center is getting on my nerves. I'm going to be honest. Your kids are falling behind because of the coronavirus. Stop telling Corona kids that they're learning very little. They are learning. They are living through a pandemic. I never thought I would live through one. Many of us never thought that in our lifetime, but we all are. They are learning something. And how can you take what they're learning at home? No matter what it is, learning doesn't mean good or bad. It just means that they're learning. And how do you invite that back into the classroom experience? And how do you capitalize on that? This is building upon social emotional learning elements. Like, how can you take what they've been experiencing and integrate in the classroom? I think that's going to be so key, because the resilience, that's how you're going to tap into the resilience and be able to cultivate it. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much. I was trying to be brief, but it didn't go brief, but thank you so much.
Sonia, that was plenty brief. I'm sure there's much more to say. We'll have the opportunity to explore a lot of those ideas. But finally, we're wrapping up with Erin Nation.
Thank you. And thank you to the other panelists. That was great. I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse to go last because you all summarized it so nicely. I'm not sure if I have all that much to add. My name is Erin Nation. I am an elementary school counselor in Oklahoma in a mid-sized district west of Oklahoma City. I started my career kind of backwards than most. I, out of college, started at the Oklahoma State Department of Education and ultimately becoming the director of early childhood for my state. Then went into the classroom, taught kindergarten, and then ultimately found my passion of being a school counselor at the elementary level. Most importantly, I'm a mom to 3 young kiddos, 6, 4, and 2. All had drive-by birthdays in the last couple months as they all turned those ages here in this new world that we're living in. And so I'm watching them. At the beginning, I felt like my own kids felt like that this was something that we do every once in a while. We stay at home for a while, that this is kind of a normal thing. And then as it went on, and as we are Oklahoma, many of the restrictions have been lifted. And so as a family, we are kind of slowly starting to get back into somewhat of a routine. And so I'm watching them now see this was not necessarily a normal thing and kind of combating some of their own anxieties with that. When we first went and visited with grandparents after being away from them, for 2 months, my son was, do I need to bring my mask? Maybe I should wear my mask. And so something that I never even thought that he would think of or want to ask was something that he was concerned of. So I think that anxiety presents itself in different ways in every kid. No 2 children are alike, and so the way that they express their anxiety and their worries is going to be different as well. Like it was already summarized, I think we don't know what we're going to see when we return to the classroom. Some things that I am kind of anticipating, and I'm educating the educators that I work with on, that we may see more of a reluctance to leave parents, some more of that separation anxiety, poor concentration and memory, distractibility, hyperactivity, and withdrawn behaviors, and then oppositional behaviors, the refusal to do schoolwork. So if we could go to my second slide, I'm going to skip over the anxiety part because I think that everyone summarized that well. Here are some of my ideas for practice, and Sonia touched on a few of these as well. An opportunity for a daily check-in and check-out with a classroom teacher or other school personnel. So allowing students, especially those that are experiencing some of those anxious tendencies, to check in each day, prepare them for the day, ensure that they're ready to learn. It can include walking around the school or take place in an office setting. Then allowing that student to check out with the same adult at the end of the day, giving them the opportunity to summarize how the day went and then reflect on how they anticipate the next day to follow. A morning classroom meeting. So this is a great time to practice some of those mindfulness practices and set the stage. I know that oftentimes morning meetings are only seen at the elementary level, but I think that they can be useful in the secondary setting as well. It can also include an opportunity to get moving, as we know that exercise is a great way to combat anxiety. A cool down spot with coping skills, a toolbox of those. It can be located in the classroom or a variety of spaces throughout the building, including age-appropriate materials to help de-escalate some of those emotions. And it's not necessarily a timeout spot, but a spot that kids can go before those emotions reach a point that can be troublesome for them and the students around them. A cool down jar where they just shake up the glitter and it all falls. Books about feelings and emotions. And then I always love a good feelings chart that includes pictures and words to go with that, letting children name those feelings. Sonia mentioned the lessons on the coping skills, including an opportunity to practice deep breathing. So it can be, giving students the resources that they can use then throughout the day. Counting to 10, appropriate use of a stress ball, books on managing emotions. There's many benefits in literature about managing emotions for students to be able to identify with the characters in a regular classroom setting and in small groups that may be working on specific anxious tendencies. Change in speech. This was kind of already mentioned as well, but I like that quote that nowhere in the history of calm down has anyone been able to calm down. So changing how we talk. It seems like you're feeling really frustrated right now. Instead of relax, because that's not necessarily going to be very helpful. The validation of feelings. I know you're feeling scared. That's not a good feeling. I want to help you. Mindfulness, that's already been spoken about, but also daily gratitude. This is something that I did a lot of research personally as an elementary school counselor last year. It was the school-wide theme for my school, daily gratitude. The more that I read about the benefits of daily gratitude, the more I wanted to implement that in my school. And so school-wide, we implemented daily gratitude and allowed opportunities for each day for students to think of things that they are grateful for. There's lots of research that shows that having a bit of daily gratitude each day provides for happier students. And so I always told my kids, who doesn't want to live a happier life? So that's why we implemented that at my school last year. Assisting with positive self-talk. So this virus is very serious, but we don't need to be scared. We need to be responsible by doing things like washing our hands. And Sonia mentioned that a little bit as well. An open space for questions. Letting kids know that your space is a safe place and that we may not have all the answers, but that it's okay to ask questions. And encouraging hope. While difficult situations can often have negative results, they can also have positive outcomes. So modeling that optimistic attitude and looking forward to the future. It was mentioned this morning in one of the first sessions, but also having teachers and administrators practice self-care, acknowledging your own reactions and feelings, sharing with children your strategies for managing those emotions and that distress in you, and then giving yourself the opportunity to seek assistance if you are needing some help. Even just saying out loud, I do this at home sometimes, I'm feeling very overwhelmed right now. Just even giving the power to those words can be helpful. So that's all for me.
Excellent. Thank you to Erin and to all of our panelists. Due to the very comprehensive preliminaries, which were great and detailed, and folks watching at home, you'll be able to consult their briefings in a short time to see all the points they laid out. We have about 20 or 25 minutes to do sort of a structured, moderated discussion. So I'm gonna hop into it with a couple of questions, and I'll direct these questions to panelists. If you feel like you'd rather pass on to another participant, that's all right. But I'd like to start maybe with a question to Jamila, and that's around the question of how educators adopt the responsibilities that they're going to need to take on. Many educators are all too happy, and some are even prepared through professional training, though not all, to help their students work through the kinds of negative emotion that they're going to be subject to over the next couple of months, and have been for the last few. But it's also important to note that there are many teachers, and perhaps most teachers, who are much less comfortable. They're very ginger around personal inquiries into the lives of students, or even into simply their emotional lives. And in a lot of instances, there are very honestly held concerns about student privacy, for instance, that lead them to that discomfort. So I'd like to ask you again, Jamila, and the other panelists, how can mental health workers in schools, school leaders, how can we help teachers be as available as possible to their students, as vigilant as possible about identifying stress, and be more willing to try to address it?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So there are a couple things that I I hear teachers responding when, as you're asking the question. So one, I've heard teachers say, I'm not a counselor. I don't know how, they expect me to be everything for these kids. I don't know how to be a counselor. What am I supposed to do? And to that, I usually address it as the fact that no one's asking teachers to be counselors, but we are asking them to continue to be the caring individuals that they already are. And it's not necessary for a teacher to know every single detail of what's going on in a child's life in order to be able to address some very basic needs. So all of our students need safety. They need physical safety, emotional safety, psychological safety. That's across the board. If a student is responding in ways that are expressing a need, then we have to kind of be in tune to that need. We don't have to know what mom did or what dad did. We don't have to know, exactly what went on at home that morning or in the past in order to be able to offer a kid a pat on the back or some time to just talk. If you ever want to chat, this would be a good time. We don't have to do that to be able to we don't have to know those things in order to be able to offer them safe spaces within our rooms where they can go and relax and just chill out if they need to, if they're feeling a little triggered, or if to do emotional check-ins, to offer them the resources that they need to be able to have the language to express what they need to express when they're ready, and to be able to address what they're feeling when they may not have the words, but they understand that I'm feeling a little off, or there's something going on in me. I do feel agitated. Everything is irritating me today. And that's the big buzzword for kids, right? Oh, she's so irritating. When they're feeling that, okay, you've acknowledged that something is going on in you. Here are some resources here's some tools that we tend to use. A lot of people will use when they're feeling this way or when they notice those things. And so that's one of those things that needs to be addressed, that we don't need teachers to be clinicians, but we do need them to connect to students in meaningful ways, and acknowledging that relationships, meaningful positive relationships are an actual protective factor. So we know that our children are already at risk for failure and harmful life outcomes in so many different ways. And the research shows that one meaningful and positive relationship can actually make the difference, can change the life trajectory of a student who is headed in the wrong direction. And so being able to prioritize building relationships without having to know all the personal details, but just building relationships, letting students know that you are a support, that you are there, that you acknowledge what they're going through, that you understand on some level, but you want to be able to support them whenever they need it. That can actually mean so much more in protecting them from a lot of the risks that they already face.
Yeah, and I want to throw it to Erin, just to explicate a little of that. You, in your briefing, included a lot of strategies about how to structure a classroom and how to structure a day in a classroom in ways that kind of put guardrails around negative emotion for kids. I don't think any administrator would ask a teacher to take on new full-time duties as a counselor on top of being an instructor, as Jamila says. Can you again just revisit how you've seen some of these strategies play out in classrooms, and what makes them effective? What makes, for instance, books on emotion and stress a useful tool in the classroom, or a cool down space, for instance?
Yeah, I think something that I tell my students is that all feelings are okay. It's okay to have all those feelings. What's not okay is to hurt somebody else with your words or your actions because of the way that you are feeling. And so I think giving them that power that that's okay to feel frustrated. I feel frustrated too sometimes, but that giving them that freedom to, have those feelings. One thing I loved, I think it was Sonia that said about with trauma, instead of, what's wrong with you? What happened to you? And so my school is in the process of becoming a trauma-informed school. It's a process. We've been going at it for several years now, and we're still not quite there. But that to predict and assume that you're facing a frightened child rather than a disobedient child. And that's something that we tell all of the people in our building. Not to just assume that someone's just being disobedient or purposely, butting up against you on purpose, that something happened to make this child react that way. And so how can we help them to work through that? I think taking that empathy and that patience and reframe children's behaviors in your own mind is something all teachers, all adults in the building can do.
That's well put.
Oh, if I can just add, Kevin, to the really helpful things that Jamila and Erin have already said, is that I think it's so important that we have a real cultural shift in our school buildings around emotional intelligence and social emotional learning. So we talk so much about teaching the kids SEL, but we also don't give the space to develop our own emotional intelligence as educators and adults in the building. And I think it's a real disservice that we do to teachers and other staff, that we expect them to check their humanity at the door and then go teach content, and then over winter break, spring break, summer break, hang out at the pool, decompress, whatever, but not give them the opportunity to feel their feelings in the work and to provide space for that. And I think it's very important that we build those spaces into our grade level team meetings, into our content team meetings, into our behavioral health team meetings, into our leadership team meetings, where, we normalize and validate the incredible challenges and stress emotionally that this work creates for us, and then give people an opportunity and a language to talk about that. What Erin had said is, it's okay to have feelings. It's not okay to take them out on people. Sometimes I want to say that to the adults in the building too, that we are taking our feelings out on our kids in the class. We are taking our feelings out on our colleagues if we don't provide an opportunity and a space for them to actually be able, and a language, to be able to experience their full humanity in the job. Then we're not allowing them to really fully educate our kids or to model appropriate emotional experiences for our students either.
Right.
Can I add to that too?
I insist that you do.
Okay, so I forgot to mention in my other slide about sustainability and practices to build that. And so whenever, Erin has mentioned some really great ideas. All of us have mentioned really nice ideas to implement in the classroom, but none of that cannot be sustained unless obviously it fits the mission and goals of what the school wants to do. So we can give all this talk and say, yep, this is good, but if the school doesn't adopt it from the top down, it won't be implemented because the administration won't support it, right? And so it's so important to have like ambassadors, key opinion leaders. Some of the work of my colleagues coming out of the University of Illinois at Chicago, the Institute of Juvenile Research, they do a lot of child's mental health and school-based and out-of-school time settings, and that's my training as well. So I've been trained by some of the experts in the field, which I'm so proud to say that we know that when teachers adopt, if we have key opinion leaders or ambassadors or somebody who can advocate for these programs to be implemented with consistency and fidelity, with the support, full backing of the administration, then we know it's going to impact really good mental health. Instead of trying to write down that last homework assignment, the very last minute, the 30 seconds of the day, it should be prioritized to check out. Because when these kids go home, we don't know what's going to happen. When they come to the door, we don't know what their journey was like before they got to school. And so we cannot assume that every child is going to be ready to learn when they come, but we can certainly create, again, systematically, a way to enhance resilience and to enhance a sense of feeling welcomed at school. And I think it's so important that that we have people who can champion for these practices to really be embedded. They can be done. Studies have shown that these things can be done, and the teachers can deliver it. They don't have to be counselors, but again, providing a sense of safety and routine and rituals is so critical for kids. Their whole life is about that. So if school is able to provide that stability, we're winning part of the battle. We really are.
Yeah. I want to get to one of the most important questions. It's probably going to be our last question, and that is an aspect that several of you talked about in your presentations, which is that of secondary trauma. And I want to preface this by saying that you may have seen the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence put out a survey pretty early in the lockdown phase. It was in early April. And they asked teachers to name the 3 most frequent emotions that they experienced in a day. They were all doing remote work, or mostly doing remote work at this time. And it was about 5,000 teachers responded. The 5 emotions that were most cited were anxiety, fear, worry, the feeling of being overwhelmed, and sadness. So this is a major concern, not just during the COVID period, but especially now, perhaps. And teachers who are working with students who have experienced loss, what kind of strategies and tools can leaders in buildings and mental health teams make available to teachers to help them work through their own stress, and how can teachers be a resource to one another? Why don't we start this with Jennifer?
That's a great question. So I think, first of all, it speaks to what I was saying earlier about there has to be a culture where feelings matter, and being able to talk about feelings matter, as well as regulation matters. And so being able to do some, breathing activities in a staff meeting. I don't know how many of you have checked out in a staff meeting, but I'm sure it's 110%. It's, right. And so I think there's some basic things that we can do to make this part of the culture. But I will also say that I worked in a school. I had the privilege for several years of doing teacher self-care process groups in a school that had prioritized teacher mental health. And one day a month, they took an hour and a half out of their PD, and they had different facilitators lead the group. The leadership team had their own group, which is really great, because usually the leadership team just checks out for that period and goes and does all the other busy stuff that they have to do. But everybody in that building had to be in a space where they could actually just decompress about the work. These groups don't have to be led by clinical social workers like myself or school counselors, but it can start with the leadership, with the behavioral health teams, kind of training people up on that. And if you have somebody who's, particularly comfortable just facilitating conversation, just creating some space. And if you don't have an hour and a half a month, which is a lot, I recognize that, maybe you have some other way of just regularly incorporating some aspect of talking about your feelings about the work, I think is really going to be particularly important going forward in this time of complete ambiguity and loss and stress and unknown for us.
I'm sure that you could all speak eloquently about this, and it's probably the most important question of the day. I just want to check in with Sonia. I mean, you're a clinician, and I'm sure that you are working or have worked with professionals, including perhaps teachers, who work in high stress fields, who are frequently providing services or giving care to people who are traumatized themselves. No doubt you've got a window onto this specifically. Can you give your thoughts on how schools can help manage this stuff?
Yeah, I think again, the school has to adopt the idea of wellness, right? So it's not just about education, it's about the whole person, it's about the whole experience of school. School contributes to mental health for both the students and for the teachers. So one of the ways, I can borrow from the field of medicine for sure, that, the University of Chicago finally, because of COVID-19, they ramped up having peer support groups. right? So there's no time for residents or fellows or anybody else. We don't have time to take care of each other, but we tell our patients to take care of themselves, and we're crappy at modeling it, right? But for once, finally, we created a peer support line because of COVID-19. All of that we've been fighting for in my department to have for our own peers who are doing medicine and have their own trauma of seeing cancer patients die and things of that nature. We created a peer group, and that has worked really well, and it's all volunteer-based. So I think a model like that can work because, again, my colleagues who have really championed something like that had put it forth, and it came to life. That type of setup came to life where we have peer leaders who then can work with typically people who have the internal resources, experience, particularly if they have received some type of training, and there could be a partnership that University of Chicago could do with teachers or schools to do compassion fatigue type of training. It's only 30 minutes. So I think that's something that peers can do. We trained our doctors on it, and they're busy as heck, surgeons, everybody. And if they can learn it in 30 minutes, I think teachers can too, and we can craft something and model it for what could work for schools. But I think the best way to go about that is peer support. And then thereafter, if there's a higher level of intervention that is needed, then obviously teachers will have to seek professional care around their wellness, which is okay. We go for tune-ups for our cars, we take care of our homes, but we need to take care of our bodies and our minds too. So I think having some type of peer support would be a nice, easily implemented, and I hope feasibly sustained as well, type of model that can be adopted. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. There's work that's done out there already around compassion fatigue, and we can model it for schools. And I think that's something that can be, Dr. Keels, I know, who's leading this conference, I'm sure can assist with that as well. And I'll throw myself in there too to help out.
Great.
Can I back on her really quickly?
Please do.
I know we're ending soon, but yeah, and so we refer to that, we meaning the TREP team, when we go into schools, we refer to that as collective care. And so prioritizing self-care and caring for, so the building, the administrators caring for the staff, making strategic and ongoing efforts to make sure that those things happen. And so it may look like Jennifer mentioned, maybe, at the beginning of staff meetings and gatherings, doing mindfulness, but it also could look like just 5 minutes, everybody pair up and just tell your neighbor how your day went, how was your week, how are things been going, and just to be able to give an outlet. But it also may look like weekly activities, weekly self-care challenges, and next to the teacher mailbox area, there's, just a little private bulletin board, like I did self-care this week, or I took a walk, or I did mindfulness for myself, just having those regular ongoing check-ins and giving teachers a space to be able to do that, but also acknowledging that we're all in this together. And it may be, food is always good, so the administrators, bringing special treats every once in a while, just to acknowledge that I know, we're in deep and we're all in this together, and I'm wishing the best for you, and my door is open if you ever need anything, those kinds of things, but on an ongoing basis.
Well, thank you so much, Jamila. Thank you to all the panelists for giving some really great, crisp presentations and a very stimulating discussion as well. To those folks watching from home, thank you for joining us, and I hope you're able to access these presentations soon.